Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Barbara Krauthammer, Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, and I'm really so pleased that you could all be with us for this very timely and panel that I'm sure is going to be an informative and engaging conversation today on lessons in leaving Vietnam and Afghanistan. We have three distinguished panelists today, and I'm going to ask them now to join me and turn on their cameras. And then I will introduce them and we'll get started with our conversation. So joining us today, we have Professor Charlie Carpenter, is a professor of political science and legal studies at UMass Amherst, specializing in international law and human security. She's also the director of the Human Security Lab at UMass, which is an interdisciplinary project that supports research in the area of human security and insecurity related to violence, human rights, and democracy in conjunction with issues of economic security, food security, climate security, and health security. Professor Carpenter's teaching and research interests include the protection of civilians, laws of war, humanitarian disarmament, political violence, and global advocacy networks. She's a prolific author. She's the author of numerous journal articles, 3 books, including one that I think will be relevant, especially today for our conversation, Innocent Women and Children, Gender Norms and the Protection of Civilians. Professor Carpenter has also served as a consultant for the United Nations, the State Department, the Department of Defense, and human rights NGOs. We're also joined by Professor Chris Appy, my colleague in the history department. Professor Appy specializes in 20th century US national culture, identity, and foreign policy. He's best known, and I'm sure many of you know his works, for his outstanding books on the history of the Vietnam War and the Vietnam era, which in his work, he's revealed the experiences and perspectives of many different people in American society: combat soldiers, policymakers, anti-war activists, journalists, and civilians. Professor Appy is the author of 4 books, including the 2015 book, American Reckoning, The Vietnam War and Our National Identity, which reviewers described, one reviewer described, quote, as an antidote to forgetting. And another reviewer called required reading for anyone interested in foreign policy and America's place in the world. Currently, he's working on a book about Daniel Ellsberg, which draws heavily on the Ellsberg papers, which we now are proud to have in our special collections and university archives in the UMass Du Bois Library. And the working title for this book is Ellsberg's Mutiny, War and Resistance in the Age of Vietnam, The Pentagon Papers and Nuclear Terror. Finally, we're really honored to have with us Charlie Sennett. Charlie is a UMass alumnus who majored in history and then went on to receive a graduate degree in journalism from Columbia University. He has, of course, enjoyed a truly distinguished career as an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, documentary filmmaker, and educator. Charlie worked at the Boston Globe for many years, I think about 15 years, where he served as the Globe's bureau chief for the Middle East and Europe. Others, of course, probably know Charlie from his work as a correspondent for PBS Frontline and the PBS NewsHour. In 2009, he founded Global Post, which is an award-winning international online news organization. And more recently, he established the Ground Truth Project in 2014, with the mission of serving undercovered communities by supporting a new generation of journalists who would do on-the-ground reporting with a commitment to truth-telling, equity, and justice in the communities they serve. Charlie recently started teaching at Boston College, but I must say we were really fortunate and quite pleased that last year he collaborated with Professor Appy to teach a course at UMass that allowed our students to do a deep dive into the Ellsberg archives and culminated with the production of a wonderful series of podcasts about Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. And all of this is still available to folks who are interested in learning more about it on our Ellsberg Conference website. Today, of course, we have these 3 distinguished scholars, journalists, authors, together to discuss the parallels, the continuities, perhaps some ruptures between the US withdrawal from Vietnam and from Afghanistan. So Charlie Sennett, I'm going to start with you. You were in Afghanistan at the very beginning in 2001, and then you were also in Afghanistan in July of this year. And I wonder if you could reflect for us a little bit on what you saw, what seemed different to you from the beginning to the end, and specifically if you could talk a little bit about the Taliban, and if you were surprised by the rapid return of the Taliban, and what that looked like on the ground.
Sure. Thanks, Steen Krauthammer. Thanks for the introduction, kind introduction, and thanks for hosting this forum. It's great to be back, even virtually. To be back is great. So yeah, my experience in Afghanistan really goes all the way back to 1993, the first World Trade Center bombing in New York City, the first one. Led me to start reporting there and watch the rise of the Taliban from 1995 right up through to when they took Kabul the next year and until 2001, September 11th, when the US invaded. So it's been this long history of watching the rise, the fall, and the rise again of the Taliban. And to answer your question, I wasn't surprised to see the Taliban back and in power, to be honest. But I was definitely surprised that it took 11 days for the government to collapse. I just don't know anyone who saw that coming. 6 months seemed reasonable. A year, maybe, a civil war that ended in a stalemate, or possibly with the Taliban taking power and some forced shared power agreement. And I think this is really hard for us to think about as people who care about Afghanistan, particularly about the rights of women, the rights of people, human rights, and who care about the future of that country. I say this with a heavy heart, but also with some reality, which is we didn't have a civil war, and that was probably a good thing. I mean, the Taliban has come back into power. I think most of us would say that doesn't feel like a very good thing. But avoiding a civil war like the one that happened in the mid-90s, which ravaged all of Afghanistan, it left it bombed back into a different century. I'm trying to reflect on what this all means, and I can't help but think, at least we avoided a catastrophic war in the end. The US failures in Afghanistan are legion. The successes are smaller, harder to see these days, but they are there. Big improvements. I mean, if you think about what Kabul looked like when I arrived September 19th, 2001 in Afghanistan, it took me a little while to get to Kabul, but I arrived in Faizabad, and it was just a bombed out ruin, and as was most of the country. So really complex, difficult terrain to travel to say, how is the Taliban right now? I'd say in its essence, the Taliban has changed, but I think the question is, has the Taliban changed as much as Afghanistan has changed? And I think the answer is no. And I think it's why they're going to have a very difficult time governing.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the long historical perspective back to the 90s. I think that's an important point for all of us to remember, that this is not something that just happened out of the blue, but that there's a long context. And so, Chris, I'd like to ask you to give us an even longer context as an expert in the history of foreign policy, to help folks situate the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in relation to the evacuation of Saigon. And maybe even thinking, you know, between Pentagon Papers and Afghanistan Papers, were any lessons learned from the past before the US went into Afghanistan this time, or were the same mistakes repeated?
Yeah, well, those are three great questions. You know, the debacle and the rout of the final days in both wars were so heart-wrenching. They came so quickly, and there was so much obvious suffering and people scrambling at the gates of the embassy in Saigon or at the airport in Afghanistan. It did lead a lot of commentators to suggest that maybe that there was something we should have done or could still do to avert this obvious disaster. And I think that's problematic and short-sighted, and it overlooks a much deeper history that in many respects in both wars they were kind of fated to end badly, in my view, in both cases. Both wars really had the original sin of a failure of democratic debate and democratic processes at their origin. Both were undeclared, as has every American war since World War II. And they were based on false pretext and a long history of public lying. And that brings us to the issue that you raised with the revelation of the Pentagon Papers and the Afghanistan Papers, the first released by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, and the Afghanistan Papers in late 1919 by the Washington Post and Craig Whitlock. And they're different in some ways, and I won't go into those details, but the one striking commonality is that they both expose this sort of really stunning evidence that at the highest levels of the American government and military, there was a quite deep understanding of the flaws and failures of American policy, and even deep pessimism that we'd ever be able to achieve our objectives. As General Lute, who was a war czar for both Bush and Obama, said, we didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were doing in Afghanistan. And yet publicly in both cases, officials would go before the American people in Congress and beat the drum of progress, that, yes, difficult war, but we have to stay the course. Nowhere was that more evident in the sort of arrogant press conferences some of you will remember by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who would mock journalists who would deign to say something like, well, are you at all worried that in Afghanistan we might get bogged down in a kind of quagmire similar to what we had in Vietnam? And he poo-pooed that, but even he privately had grave reservations. So there are a lot of parallels, and I'll just mention one further one, aside from the fact that they were both based on, they're both undeclared and based on false pretexts and a series of lies, and that is that in both instances, hundreds of thousands of American military personnel were sent thousands of miles away to very unfamiliar countries and cultures to try to prop up governments that did not have the broad support of their own people or militaries. And that was really, from the beginning, a fatal flaw, and was really sending the military into, in my view, an impossible mission. So, that's my little introduction, but we'll stop there.
Thank you. Charlie Carpenter, Chris raises the point, right, that the talk about suffering and a refugee crisis maybe, leads us to ask the wrong questions, right, about the origins and responsibilities of these wars. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see the attention to actual suffering, right, human rights issues, questions of women's rights in particular in Afghanistan. And if you've seen any change over time in sort of popular understanding of women's rights and really the political response to it, and how that maybe will inform policy going forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess I want to start by following up on Professor Appy's point, which is that we didn't have to look at it entirely this way. I think about the Vietnam analogy as a metaphor for Afghanistan. And I think about how the use of that analogy by policymakers really predisposed the US to thinking about its policy options in particular ways rather than others, and blinded it to other foreign policy tools. The very idea that we were fighting a war rather than doing a humanitarian intervention or creating the conditions for durable peace, as we did in Bosnia, for example. This really predisposed us to certain ways of thinking about it. And one thing that's a contrast between the early 21st century situation and the 1970s is that the international community has changed, has a lot of other tools, has put women, peace, and security on the international agenda, has a great track record of peacekeeping in these situations. So We didn't have to go in and fight a counterinsurgency. We didn't have to withdraw the way we did. If you are fighting a war, you sort of think you have to either win at some point or you've lost. But no, we had the potential, for example, to stand up a UN peacekeeping mission there in 2002 and get the US out, but the UN in. This could have worked quite well then. The Taliban actually asked for one in 2009, and it's something that could have been pressed for before the US left, or even put in place when it became clear that the withdrawal was going to be so catastrophic in humanitarian terms. And these kinds of missions actually have a much better track record in protecting women's human rights, building human rights culture, providing access to the humanitarian groups, and creating, sort of tamping down intra-Afghan conflict, which is another thing that really protects civilians and protects women. And it's fascinating to me that none of that was on the table. I run this research group here at UMass, and after the withdrawal began and we saw what was happening, we did a bunch of stakeholder consultations, me and a bunch of students who I bring into my research process, and we produced a policy brief on the idea of peacekeeping. And it was fascinating to me how much pushback there was from the policy community at the very idea. They just hadn't even thought about it. And I really wonder how thinking about Afghanistan in terms of Vietnam, rather than in terms of Bosnia, in terms of Kosovo, places where these other forms of multilateral action have really worked, has made a difference. I can say more about women specifically if you like, but I'm happy to pass the baton and come back to that later in the conversation.
Sure. Well, why don't we stick with this question? I think you raise a really interesting question of, how is it that policymakers put themselves in the position, it sounds like you're saying, of making the analogy between Afghanistan and Vietnam and not Afghanistan and someplace else, right? And not Bosnia, for example, right? Why military intervention and not a humanitarian intervention? And so, Chris, Charlie Sennett, I don't know, is this something that you've seen and thought about?
I would say I have thought a lot about that, and I've had a great chance to really spend time with and interview some of the architects of the military campaign in Afghanistan, from Petraeus to General Milley. I just have been in touch with Milley recently and interviewed him, and I would say I think there's a profound substantive difference that we all know, but it's kind of worth noting that Vietnam, Gulf of Tonkin was a fabrication, history proved, and it was a distant threat, it seemed, to most of us, to think of the context of the Cold War and how Southeast Asia was part of that. Afghanistan was a direct attack on American soil in downtown Manhattan that killed 3,000 people, that silenced this country in grief, and then in unity of purpose, and we responded. And I am so aware of the failures of American arrogance and the ways in which we carried ourselves without learning any of the history of how we should go into a country with respect, with understanding its culture, with trying to help out. But I feel like there's a framing we're missing here, which is our country was attacked. That's why we went into Afghanistan. They were not, the United States, were not attacked by Afghanistan, of course. We were attacked by a terrorist organization that was given a home in Afghanistan and a base of operation. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And I really think that these are such obvious statements. They're things we know, but 20 years later, I find myself sometimes having to remind students of the basics of they don't remember it. They were not alive when it happened. Many of the students I have this year. So that history matters. We lost the plot very quickly. We went in, we said, to topple the Taliban regime because it gave countenance and protection and comfort to our enemy, Al-Qaeda, and we went in to destroy Al-Qaeda. And then we just quickly lost the plot. We just forgot what our mission was. And we started to expand the definition of the war into a global war on terror. We did the fateful decision of going to the war in Iraq, which was one of the great disasters of American foreign policy. But you kind of have to walk through the slow motion accident of Afghanistan, train wreck of Afghanistan, to recognize every mistake we made But I think our original reasons for going in were profoundly different than Vietnam, I would argue. And it was a different basis. We had an opportunity to do a contained and very direct response to an attack on our soil. Then we blew it, as I say. So once we started to drift, we then went in with too small a force. The Taliban were allowed to go across into Pakistan. I was there when we were watching this happen in real time, and you thought, why is this happening? They went in and they regrouped inside of Pakistan. And they, of course, had the famous phrase we learned very early in Afghanistan, which is, you have the watches, but we have the time. And they simply waited. And they waited for the United States to make one mistake after another, to fail to understand where it was. And like in Vietnam, to experience a culture that resists empire through history. That's something that I think Afghanistan and Vietnam have very much in common, which is these are two cultures that have defined themselves as resisting empires who tried to come in. For the Afghans, we know, it began with Genghis Khan, but then it was the British, then it was the Soviets, and then it was the United States. And I also think we failed to understand the terrain. Another thing that I think, very different places, of course, but both have very almost impenetrable terrain for a conventional army to try to go in the way we went into Afghanistan or we went into Vietnam. And the clumsiness and the mistakes just continue. We let the Taliban escape, they regroup. We allow a government that is a kleptocracy to thrive on corruption. And we started paying for that corruption. We started paying it like a protection racket, where the Taliban were making 15 to 20% of the cut of every contract because they were paying off the warlords and we were paying off the Taliban, and we were creating an energy and an enterprise for the Taliban to regroup. And I think one of the great failures, many failures of the Bush administration, legion, but also a failure of the Obama administration, I think, was to effectively carry out a surge, which began to have great impact. And I thought that President Obama stuck to his commitment to bring bin Laden to justice, even if it meant going into Pakistan to get him. And he did it. And it was a success. It was a tremendous, I think, success in terms of a point at which we had the upper hand, justice was carried out, the Taliban was on the back foot, and that was the moment, I think, to have cut a deal. And I think for political calculations, the Obama administration, just like the Bush administration, had political considerations, and we didn't do it then. Trump, legions of failures. The peace deal was a disaster. And then now under President Biden, we stumble again on the exit through very poor planning. Really just tactically poor planning. I think things could have gone differently. So I would just say through it all, the policies have to be broken down stage by stage, failure by failure. But the origin, the reason we went in, maybe I'm revealing that I'm not a pacifist here. I believe we had to respond. I just think we blew it from the arrogance that we've shown every time we carry ourselves in the world through our military.
If I could pick up on that, I think Charlie's right that the origin story is very different for Afghanistan, and many Americans were willing to be on board with Bush's stated claim to bring al-Qaeda to justice for their attack on the United States. But he was announcing the global war on terror even before that war was initiated, in this broad brush claim that you're either with us or against us. And this left the international community with no power to suggest a more nuanced police action sort of response. So even our military attacks on al-Qaeda were proved to be feckless. And indeed, it wasn't just the Taliban that was crossing the border early on, it was the al-Qaeda. So I really have problems with the war from its origins. I certainly wouldn't have endorsed it all the way through 9/11 and the death of bin Laden. This was really a case of mission creep on steroids, as you alluded to. I mean, there was, of course, the going after al-Qaeda, but immediately, shockingly to the Bush administration, the Taliban collapsed almost immediately because the warlords were proved to be quite effective with their suitcases full of CIA cash in bringing the Taliban to an end. And then the question becomes, well, what's next? And then there was this involvement in a kind of nation building that they would never even admit they were doing it until I think David Petraeus finally admitted, yes, well, to Congress, yes, we are involved in nation building. It's not just a military effort, but the military side of it, as Charlie Carpenter alluded to it, really pushes aside the more humanitarian issues. And as for the rights of women, yeah, there were signs of progress, but it's always really, and correct me if I'm wrong, Charlie, but really a sidebar to the major American strategic mission and full of contradictions. I mean, even as we were using women's right as a justification for the prolongation of the war, our military was tolerating and even enabling ongoing, pedophilia committed by various high-ranking people in the government and the military. So that, along with the sponsoring of corruption, most notably the despite billions of dollars spent to try to eradicate the opium trade, Afghanistan is now producing 80 to 90% of the world's heroin. We were really effectively supporting a narco state for 20 years. So there's so many problems to point to, but whether, and I even have skepticism whether or not if we had abandoned the military effort or made it more like a police action and focused entirely on the humanitarian, whether that could have ever been done consistently and effectively. But Charlie Carpenter may have a different view of that.
Charlie Carpenter, do you want to pick it up here?
Yeah, sure. Well, I absolutely agree with both Charlie and Christian. Vietnam and Afghanistan, I think, both demonstrate that the U.S. is, well, Afghanistan does. Afghanistan demonstrates, and I think some recent wars demonstrate, the U.S. is really good at rapid, sort of low casualty, relatively surgical regime change operations. But we are terrible at nation building, and we are really bad at counterinsurgency. We can't win counterinsurgencies. But the thing is, the alternative never had to be leaving countries to their fate and letting predatory regimes prey on the civilians, abandoning civilians to jihadism and humanitarian chaos. In Kosovo, we went in with that surgical strike pretty quickly. I think it was a 60-day war. We won, we got out, and the UN took over to rebuild. That's been a success. It's places like Libya where the intervention, it was successful, but it wasn't followed by that UN peacekeeping mission. That's where we see things fall into chaos. Or places like Syria where you have no intervention to begin with, and then you see massive atrocities. So in Afghanistan, you actually had the intervention and you did have a stabilization mission, at least an attempted one. But the problem is it was the wrong type of mission. It was run as a counterinsurgency. It was not run as a peacekeeping mission where you have the consent of both parties and a durable negotiation. So we chose a model we didn't know, we knew wouldn't work. We should have known wouldn't work. And we in essence, we neither learned the lessons of Vietnam about what doesn't work, but we also we ignored the positive lessons from the 1990s, from Kosovo, from Bosnia, about what could actually work. And that's really a tragedy. And Christian, you're absolutely right. This was never initially about humanitarianism or about women's rights. If it had been, we would have been in there in 1996, when the Taliban first took over and imposed gender apartheid. There was more than enough rationale for an intervention. And there's all kinds of political reasons why you sometimes see an intervention, you sometimes don't. But this was a national security issue. We did pivot, though, after we won that war, to trying to figure out how to build democracy, how to protect civilians, how to support women's human rights. And I do think it's really important not to lose sight of what the U.S. got right, or let the perfect be the enemy of the good, especially when it comes to something like women's rights. We weren't perfect, but women were much better off as a general group, and women are not a general group. I can say more about that later if you want, but as a group, they were much better off when the US was there than they were before or are now. We did things, and the US military got better. It got better in its mindset during the period in Afghanistan, and because of Afghanistan, we developed a condolence payments program. We began actually recording the number of civilian casualties we were creating so we could reduce them. We created enhanced rules of engagement to protect civilians. I know you may not hear about this stuff in the media, but these are some of the things that have been going on behind the scenes. Is it enough? No, but it's better than it was. And so it depends a lot on what you compare it to, what analogies you use. I could tell the humanitarian evacuation is another interesting parallel between Afghanistan and Vietnam, right? And it was successful in both cases in the sense that it allowed an escape route for hundreds of thousands of civilians who otherwise would probably be dead now. Was it too little and too late? Yes, and catastrophically so. But at the same time, the positive impact of airlifting those however many hundreds of thousands of people out, even the little that was done at the last minute, shows how much more could have been done sooner had there been political will. And it shows how effective airlifts can be in situations where civilians need a pathway to escape impending disaster. You know, this is a small success story that Afghanistan shared with the exit from Vietnam, and which was completely absent in places like Syria, for example, where or Myanmar today, where a humanitarian airlift could be the best way to protect civilians from a situation in which they're very, very vulnerable. And instead, and this was much the case in the Cold War. In the Cold War, in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan saw us, he valorized the US as an immigrant nation, he welcomed refugees. And in the Cold War, the US saw being a refugee nation as part of its soft power. It was how we established our moral high ground. People want to come to us. We were getting intelligence on our adversaries. Now we have started to see refugees as a security threat, and we keep them out. So instead of airlifting civilians out of Syria, they're drowning in the Mediterranean trying to escape by water. So these are political decisions. This is not inevitable at all. And if you want to look for some success stories in Afghanistan, again, you just have to compare it to places where you didn't even have airplanes lifting people out. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. So all of this makes me think, Charlie Sennett, I want to come back to you and your recent trips to Afghanistan to get a feel from you of what people were saying, right? I mean, you have a long history of building relationships with people on the ground. And so all of this is happening, right? And we've been talking about the policy level, the tactics, motivations, missteps, and so forth. But what about people on the ground? What were people saying to you about the Taliban, about the collapse of the government, the return of the Taliban? Was there a sense that the Taliban had indeed changed over these many years? Or were people, happy to see a corrupt government fall? Or what was sort of the temperature on the ground?
Great questions. And, there's, of course, so many different answers to that question, depending on where you are in the country, who you're talking to, what the context is in which you're talking to them. Are you alone, or are you with, inside with if you're anywhere near the American military, you're going to get a very different answer than if you're out in a village all alone trying to talk to people. One of the challenges of reporting in Afghanistan is it grew increasingly dangerous. It got harder and harder for us to get out into the field and get what I would call the ground truth of the story, right? Like to be there on the ground, to really feel it. And the risks became extraordinary, but the Globe was incredibly generous and supportive to give me a chance to go back to some of the places that I had reported on for them. One of them, a girls' school, which is near, sort of just outside of Kabul, in a certain district near Kunar, near Logar province in the Muhammad Aga district. And this school, I've just known it from the day it was built. It's got an amazing connection to Massachusetts in that one of the victims of 9/11, one of the first planes out of Logan Airport carried a young man named Peter Goodrich. He was killed, but when he was at Bates College, he studied comparative religions, and he loved studying Islam and Christianity. And even as a young adult, he was going into his 30s, but he still kept a Quran and he kept notes in it, and he studied on his own, and he really had a passion for trying to understand Islam. So his mother, a school teacher, his father, a lawyer, honored him by building a girls' school in this province. Beautiful school, and I really felt connected to its story. So when I went back in July of this year, I met with the principal, I met with some of the teachers and some of the students, and I've visited them many times. And the principal was defiant in her sense that we must stay. We're going to have to tough this out. We have to stand strong for girls' schools and women's rights. I think I left right at the end of July. By August 5th, one of the biggest battles of the Taliban coming into Kabul happened right in front of the school. The school was shot up. The whole community was paralyzed with fear and what would happen next. And the principal was soon calling Don Goodrich, the lawyer who was the father of Peter Goodrich, who the school was dedicated to, and calling me and asking for any help in trying to get her to the airport, to get her out. So the long and short of it is, in the time between when I left, when she felt confident that we're going to fight, to the reality of 11 days, the government collapsed. She was panicked and wanted to get her family out. So she, her husband, their 5 children did get out. We got them into the airport. We got them into one of the military bases. They were at Fort McCoy for a while, and they are now here coming to New England soon and going to be living here in Vermont. And their harrowing journey is the one that I kind of hold in my mind, that a woman who dedicated her life, who risked her life for girls' education, saw that as the Taliban returned, she was targeted. She was going to be threatened with death. So very real, visceral, from her point of view, that the Taliban would never allow her to do what she felt she had to do, which is teach young women. That was never going to happen. But another conversation I think was also really important that I had, and so many, too many to share, but I'll just share these 2. So the principal, and the other one was an organization I know called Wadan, which is an NGO, was where I stayed, and they support lots of different programs. And they've opened my eyes, because they're an Afghan NGO and I'm only dealing Afghan to Afghan. I get a different level of honesty. So they took me into a program they have to help with young entrepreneurs. So young people in their 20s, educated, are trying to start little businesses, very small businesses. And they held a lunch with all these young entrepreneurs, and it was just such an eye-opening view into youth. And 2 friends from this organization went into a conversation that I think defines the future of Afghanistan. A young woman makes like place settings and things out of refuse, plastic, and they're beautiful. They're really beautiful design. They're quite attractive. And she used to sell them in markets. And she does okay. And she has an entrepreneurial spirit. She told me about her thing. Then next to her was a young man who grows mushrooms and sells them to restaurants and has this very successful business and delicious mushrooms. And then they fell into a conversation where I asked them, well, what do you think will happen if the Taliban comes back? And the young woman said, I don't think I'll be able to work. I'll live like my mother did. And I remember when there were public executions in the square by the Taliban and the bodies hanging in this town square. And I think we're going to go back to that. And I'm very fearful. The mushroom grower said, I support the Taliban and I believe they've changed. And then the young woman said, are you kidding? How can you be my friend and say you think they've changed? They're not going to be any different. And he said, well, if they really don't allow you to work, and if they really do begin hanging people in public squares again, then I won't support them and no one will. But I think they've changed. I truthfully I don't know who's right. And maybe they'll both have shades of being right. But I think that's the question right now is Afghanistan has changed profoundly. But the Taliban has changed somewhat, and I don't think enough. And I think they will fail to govern. And I think their government may collapse as well. So I feel like this sad, terrible story of one mistaken policy after the next has left Afghanistan in a place where this saga isn't over. And I don't know what's going to happen with the Taliban, but I would say it's quite possible they collapse as well. And we descend into more uncertainty. And, I think if you've ever been there, you can't help but love the place. I think a lot of journalists who covered Vietnam feel the same. You get to know the people and you start to become invested in these lives and the tremendous spirit they bring to life and resiliency they have. I think something else the cultures share, Vietnam and Afghanistan, is resiliency. So I kind of, in the end of the day, I believe in Afghanistan. I believe it's a resilient place. I think it will emerge somehow. It always seems to do that, despite the empires that have tried to reduce it to, in many cases, rubble. I think now we just have to sort of find a way to support the people of Afghanistan. And this is going to be in the next big policy challenge. And, you know, Charlie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on like sanctions. Are sanctions a good idea? I don't see that doing anything except helping the Taliban. So how can we effectively funnel aid, support, and help the people of Afghanistan live decent lives with healthcare and COVID vaccines and the things they're going to need? I think that's our next challenge. And I'd love to hear more on how we approach that as a country, to think through it from a humanitarian perspective.
I don't know if I'm next in the queue, but I'm happy
Sure,
to
go
speak to
ahead.
that.
Please.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly difficult dilemma. It can be difficult to channel humanitarian aid to civilians when you have a government that doesn't care about civilians, who will take the aid and use it for themselves. It becomes a de facto support of the government. At the same time, you have to get aid to civilians. So you've got something that I think is not talked about enough is the need to draw on local civilian perspectives on what they need and which policy solutions are likely to be best for them. Now, not that they always know what's best for them, because they may not even understand all the options, just like stakeholders in the US don't. But they have perspectives and they have on the ground intuitive understandings that can be really, really helpful. And right now, one of the problems in Afghanistan is it's very, very hard to know what women and girls want and which women and girls want what, down across different demographics, different regions. And the reason for that is that the organization that was doing public opinion surveys in Afghanistan, Asia Foundation, has had to pull out because its staff was going to be killed. So we have sort of a data vacuum there right now, which is unfortunate. One of the things my lab is doing is thinking about how to get around that and how to conduct some limited surveys at least, where we can get some answers to those questions. But one of the things we know already is that everybody doesn't think alike. So
I'm not able to hear Charlie. I don't know if others are.
I think we've lost Charlie's audio.
Frozen, so maybe I'll just jump in and say a few.
Yeah, Chris,
when
please.
when we get her back, we'll turn it back to her. Charlie's stories are very moving, and there's so many of them. And I've always been struck by how, as horrible as American foreign policy has been, there are individuals and groups and even foreign service officers who are highly idealistic. But I myself think we should never lose sight of the imperial underpinning of all of that history, which could sort of not only compromise those great idealistic individual efforts, but really overwhelms them. I mean, most Americans don't quite realize that we continue to have 800 military bases on foreign soil, that we conduct over 125 military operations. I say military operations in 125 or 130 countries, 2/3 of the world's countries every year, that we spend more on the military than the next 11 most militarized countries on Earth, that the US military is the biggest user of fossil fuels in the world. So, in my own sense is that unless we greatly scale back the American imperial ambition and footprint around the globe, we're not really going to be able to persuade anyone that our sole mission is humanitarian. And I even have difficulty thinking of the evacuations as even partial qualified success stories in light of the creation of refugees by our own policy. Yes, we got more than 100,000 Afghans out in a few weeks, which is remarkable. but 5 million Afghans had become refugees during this long war. And in Vietnam as well, yes, we got some people out, and then on their own, many more Vietnamese managed to escape. But during the war itself, many millions, some people think as many as 10 million Vietnamese became refugees by intention. The American military engaged in the forced relocation, which itself is in international law defined as a war crime, the forced relocation of rural peasants to get them away from the places where they might lend support and intelligence and food and recruits for the National Liberation Force, and driving them into the city or into refugee camps or shanty towns on the outskirts of American bases. So again, I just think that larger analysis of American imperialism is something that's missing in American public debate and should be there. I mean, for example, just in the last 2 years with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the term systemic or institutional racism has actually now entered into public discourse in a way that had never happened in my lifetime, although it has been around my whole lifetime. Why not? This could be an opportunity. Recent, the evacuation of Afghanistan, to have a real discussion about American foreign policy that gets beyond these platitudes about global leadership and responsibility, and really talks about what it means to be an empire, and whether that's what we want to be, and if so, can that coexist with democracy? I think not, and that we have not really been committed to democracy at home or abroad. So.
Thanks, Chris. This actually anticipated a question I wanted to bring up for each of you, right? Which was, right, what seems to me either, I don't know if it's an irony or willful blindness or just the nature of the human condition, right? That it's much easier for Americans to critique the failures of democracy and human rights abroad. And the US has long struggled, right, to make good on democratic ideals at home. And, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement as sort of one of those flashpoints of really spotlighting that, right, and spotlighting that contradiction. And I think certainly the events of January 6th brought that home again, right, into even greater relief. And so I guess a question for all of you then is, how do you see the future of US policy? But even more than that, what do you expect for the future of public response to US policy? Like, do you anticipate a legitimate and sustained critique of US foreign policy, perhaps as part of what we're seeing across the country and internationally of social movements, and social movements that are rising from young people in particular? Right. So I'd also love it if maybe you want to reflect on how are your students making sense of everything in light of a climate crisis, in light of sort of widespread human rights issues across the, right? We haven't even talked about sort of North Africa, right? We could look all over the globe, right? I think Charlie mentioned Myanmar earlier, right? There are all sorts of case studies we could point to. And I wonder, if you think the students are going to be sort of the next wave of a large-scale social movement that shines that light on the failures of democracy at home, and how that translates to imperialism abroad. It's a big question, so jump in wherever seems appropriate. Charlie, do you want to start? Senate?
Sure. It is a big question. I think Afghanistan presents a moment. I really love the way Chris challenges this time to be a time to learn, the same way the reckoning we've hopefully experienced. I hope it's a true racial reckoning underway in our country. I'm hopeful, but not yet convinced that's the case after George Floyd. But I do think Afghanistan presents, like the George Floyd murder presented, an opportunity for a tipping point. And I think the tipping point is the limits of American power. But, look what we brought to that country. We brought the most sophisticated military on earth. We brought more firepower than any other civilization has ever had. And yet, what did it accomplish? I mean, what did it really do to change much? I mean, I definitely do not want to underestimate the fact that women are in school now. Like, the girls' school I covered shut down because it was in the middle of a very intense front line. But most of the girls' schools are open, and to different degrees are, girls and women are being allowed to be educated. I think that is a massive success that I hope will sustain. And I don't want to diminish that one. But beyond that, the building of roads, the building of hospitals, the building of institutions of a democracy, although the democracy never really held, hard fought, not to be diminished, not to be thrown aside. But you would have to come out of about 20 years in Afghanistan and argue, at least ask the difficult question, was it worth it? And I don't know many people, including those who fought in that war, who could say a definitive yes. And I think some of the proof of this will be, we have not, thank God, had another 9/11 level terrorist attack in our country. So a proof point could be, if we contain the organization of Al-Qaeda, if we dismantled them enough that we put them out of business, that might make it worth it. But the thing that is the framing we have to challenge ourselves to think about is, there are tremendous limits to American power, and we just ran up right against them. So the question is, how now are we going to learn about the way forward? And I think two things that give me hope, teaching a lot of young people and hearing how they think, I get a lot of hope from the sense that they seem very ready for challenges, especially students right now. The resilience of this generation that's gone through COVID is interesting to me. And I think there's great possibilities there. But I think what they're telling me is they feel like we're squandering the opportunity through COVID to become a global leader in a different way. In other words, here is our moment. We can bring medicine, we can bring technology, we can really bring the things we believe in to the world. And where is that effort? And that, I think, is a challenge to us right now that's right upon us. Limits of American power, military power are here. But I do believe in a leadership role for the United States, if we can live up to it, is presented to us by COVID.
Thanks. Charlie Carpenter, I see you nodding. Do you want to jump in here?
I'm sorry, I lost my internet connection there for a moment. Well, I just agree with everything Charles just said. I can't speak for students to answer your question, but I can say, I mean, maybe we should have a panel of them on this and get their ideas. But I will say, you're right, students have always been, and young people have always been at the forefront of movements and political change. That's no different now. I think of how popular Bernie Sanders was among that age group. Not only college students, I've got students and I've got college-age children who were attracted to him, not just because of his domestic social policy, but because of his attitude toward global affairs. And he did have that different idea on global leadership. And he did want to pull back from forever wars, which does make sense because we're not good at those. We're good at the short-term ones. But he also wanted to put energy into multilateral institution building and really deal with global problems that require a global approach: pandemics, climate change, poverty. And the civil war prevention is one of those. So rebuilding the UN peacekeeping budget and really putting money into that, because that's what works. I think these are some facets of what I see in the younger perspective on where our global policy should go that is a bit different. And obviously he wasn't elected. So it goes to show that there's more work to be done to bring that about, if that's the direction the US should go. But I also appreciated what Charlie said about education as an impetus to political change, and tying it back to Afghanistan. It is true. It's one of the reasons people focus on women being in school, is not just that it's because education is tied to so many other human rights, and it is education that allows people to fight for those rights. It's one of the reasons dictatorships close schools, and countries that want to keep women down keep them out of school. So right before I lost my internet connection, I was going to say something more about women and girls in Afghanistan. And the first thing is that, just like students, because they're not all Bernie Sanders supporters, they have a range of views. Women have a range of views. There's a big divide between urban and rural women. We often hear from urban women in Afghanistan, and they are the ones who are most likely to say, we wish the US had stayed. Maybe in a different capacity, but we wish the US had stayed. And this is based on survey data we've got in the field right now. But rural women saw it a little bit differently. And there was a great New Yorker article recently sort of analyzing them. They were the ones whose most of these civilian deaths were happening in rural areas. These are women who wanted the US out because they feared drone strikes were going to kill their kids. So different women are in different situations. Different women in Afghanistan have benefited in different ways from these institutions and taken different risks. And so it's really important not to lump them all together. But that said, having girls out of school, the schools aren't really reopened. Girls can go to school up till like 8th grade, I think. And the only high schools that have reopened for girls are in the north. And college is out of the question. So there's been a huge step backwards. Women are being flogged in the streets. Women are being sold by their parents because it's the only way to get food and or prevent the sons from being executed. Forced marriage is rampant, etc. So there's a huge problem here. It's not just a problem for women, though. Men are also being targeted for reasons to do with gender. You're going to get flogged if you trim your beard as well. Journalists are being targeted. Gender minorities are being targeted in different ways. The Hazara are being ethnically cleansed. So there's a lot of problems going on, but and one of the things we've found in our surveys already is that men and women are equally likely to say 80% of men and women that we've surveyed so far say they believe their life is at risk because of the Taliban. So there's not a gender differential there. But that said, gender apartheid is different from all of those things. Locking women up in their homes and basically keeping them there and putting them under the control of their male relatives, it is linked to so many other human rights abuses, and it is like a prison sentence for life. And that fits the definition of apartheid in the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. It is a crime against humanity. It's something the court could address if it wanted. Who knows if that will happen? But this is a serious, different dimension of human rights abuse on top of everything that all the civilians are facing there in Afghanistan. So again, what should the US do about it? I think that it was never a zero-sum thing between being in there in a war context and abandoning Afghanistan to jihadism. There are shades of gray there. Human Security Lab is working really hard to find out what civilians think in Afghanistan about those shades of gray. But I think listening to young people is extremely important as we move forward. And the ones that I'm closest in touch with, the ones that self-select into my classes, of course, are ones that have a more global vision and one that ties us together as a human family. But they would prefer policies that operate on a different level, on more of a grassroots level and on a multilateral level, rather than these heavy footprint operations that the US is not very good at.
Great. Well, I see we're at the top of the hour. So I want to thank all three of my guests. This was really a great conversation. I think you gave us a lot to think about. It was informative. I hope everyone goes back to the news media with a new perspective and some new information to help them understand what they're seeing on TV, or I guess on the internet, right? This is how my kids always say, this is how we know you're old. People don't watch TV anymore, right? They stream the news on their iPads, or what we read in the papers. But this was tremendous. And I just want to encourage everyone who's watched the panel today to please check out the website for the Human Security Lab at UMass Amherst, and also Charlie Sennett's Ground Truth Project. And lastly, the Ellsberg Conference website that Chris and Charlie built with their class last semester and with the help of the UMass Library and the Ellsberg Collection. I think a lot of great resources for people to continue learning and continue these conversations about Afghanistan, Vietnam, US foreign policy, human rights, and global security issues writ large. So thank you all very much. This was terrific and a great way to spend an hour with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.